yesterday evening. And then in the second lecture, we'll be looking at concept of the sexual revolution, concept and the historical phenomenon of the sexual revolution. Why did Abhishek and I choose this very trendy word affect to describe sexual representation? It's sort of a hot word in the humanities right now. All of my doctoral students are using affect theory. I'm not a #1 fan of affect theory, but I plugged it in and basically we're thinking about sexual representation as images of affect, images affecting patterns of not specific concrete feelings, but amorphous patterns of desire, arousal, fulfillment or alienation, feelings of belonging, connection, and community. And we've already seen that in those 6 films we saw yesterday. Another very important concept over the last decade in queer theory has been an archive of feeling. It was an important book written by Anne Kvetkovich in the US, talking about how the archive provides us not only with dry documents and data and empirical material, but connects us to feelings, feelings of community, of connection, of identity from the past. It allows us to connect to the past, not only empirically, but affectively. And I think that's what we're trying to do with these 6 films from the 1960s and 70s and the final film from the 1920s. So we're not only looking at these isolated texts from the past, descriptively and empirically, we're looking in terms of their intended affect in their context, but also how they touch us across time, across history. So that's sort of an ambitious project for today. I had you read in this connection Kenneth Plummer. He's sort of a inspiration for me. He's a sociologist. He's now retired. And his most important book was called Telling Sexual Stories. And he also founded the important interdisciplinary journal Sexualities out of the UK. I couldn't ask you to read the whole book, Telling Sexual Stories. So I found an early version of it, Telling Sexual Stories, sort of an article testing the waters. I'm sorry it was a little bit confusing and out of order. Did you find that when you were reading it? Or did you manage to absorb the basic ideas without getting too alienated from the piece? So this is what we're using in the first lecture. I think as a sociologist, it's interesting that today we are reading 2 social scientists, Kenneth Plummer and Jeffrey Escoffier, even though we're talking about affect and feeling. So this is sort of a contradictory position, but I think it's a productive one. What do social scientists have to tell us about feeling, about affect? And as a sociologist, he listened to thousands of stories, I think, people telling him about their sex lives, their sexual identities, their sexual feelings, and came to these descriptive generalizations about those stories. He stresses how important it is not to look at stories in isolation, but as social interactions with other people, with communities. He'd call he sees them as social performances. So it's a really interesting thing to look at our films also as social performances, not art objects in the isolation, but art objects that intervene in relationships with us as an audience, with the original audience, with performers. He says that every story has tellers, coaxers, and consumers. Every story is a product, but they come from this network relationships among people who tell the story, people who facilitate the story, people who listen to the story, the consumer. He distinguishes between modern and late modern stories.
He also talks about journey somewhere, no?
He does indeed. And we will come to that in a minute when we think about our specific films. The contemporary stories, the stories of the late modern period, he talks about in terms of participation, deconstruction, difference, and multiplicity. Modern stories very often were assumed to be coherent and unified and linear. This sense of wholeness, he says, has evaporated in the late modern or postmodern period. And maybe we can think about our films if we see that pattern taking place in our films. Modern stories were, I'm going to the bottom line of this slide now, modern stories were assumed to be telling the truth and delineating the essence of who we are. Modern stories are about our identities as storytellers or listeners. But increasingly in the age of the internet, his article is pre-internet, but I think what he says applies to the age of the internet. Our stories are what he calls recursive. They incorporate other people's stories. They're not original. We borrow and cite and pastiche other people's stories. They're much more ambiguous. They're much more fragmentary. And he doesn't get into this very much, but he does talk about certain contradictions. He talks about a kind of emancipatory and utopian operation of stories. They make us, they fulfill us, they act as therapy, they establish our community, but at the same time, they are, storytelling is an industry. In the book we're working on right now, we've just submitted it, someone calls this late modern apparatus of storytelling the first person industrial complex. And I think that's a good critique of the massive operation of storytelling in the age of the internet, social media, etc. So there's a really real contradiction going on. Stories are very meaningful for us individually, very often, but at the same time, they're commodities. They overtake us. They dominate us. They make us consumers or buyers rather than agents. They remove our agency. So this is a contradiction that's essential for this landscape of storytelling. Any questions so far? And let's use these ideas to understand yesterday's 6 discoveries from the archives from the 1960s and 70s. Let's start with fuses, since I've had so many questions about fuses. Can you, what is going on in fuses? Well, Carolee Schneemann is a member of the New York avant-garde artist community. She's an interdisciplinary artist. She's a performance artist. She's a visual artist, a painter, and she's a filmmaker. So she is borrowing, as a filmmaker, she's borrowing her practice from the visual arts. Remember, we're in the 1960s, and the American visual arts are in many ways dominating the world art market. It is a market. In the 1960s, abstraction, which was the dominant, abstract impressionism or abstraction was the dominant format of the 1950s, a huge market, and it was no coincidence that during the Cold War, abstraction, this kind of deletion of all social reference, became the prescribed dominant art form. Abstraction segued into the 1960s into pop art, performance art, conceptual art, body art. So she's doing all these things as a filmmaker, but she's maintaining abstraction. If you look at her film, very much of it looks like a moving abstract painting, right? With these lovely and mysterious fragmentary patterns. So we don't even need to know what is going on. It's just very beautiful, moving, abstract patterns. But we know something is going on. I warned you this was an autobiographical film, and the beginning opening credit defines it as an autobiographical film. Doesn't she say, this is a film about myself, my partner, Tenny, I forget his first name, James Tenny, and our cat. And as soon as we started recognizing these three entities, this confirms our reading of the film as autobiographical. Even though these images are fleeting, they disappear the minute we see them. We see two bodies, human bodies and a cat. They never remain on the screen. They're very evanescent, aren't they? They're ephemeral. They don't stick. And we need to watch very carefully to identify movement or bodies or actions on the screen. Why do you think she relies so much on abstraction and refuses to indulge in clarity, in full information? She's quite uncooperative for with our desire for a story, isn't she? She refuses us clarity. Any thoughts about that? Why she might insist on fragmenting these images, these stories? What might her motivation be? Did you think while you were looking at it, why is she doing this? Well, we can speculate. She's certainly interested in the idiom and iconography of abstraction, and she's interested in the materiality of celluloid. Her paintings are about paint and canvas. Her films are about celluloid. So she wrestles with these strips of celluloid. She scratches them, she paints them. She wants us to know that this is a material object, a film going through the projector, and she is celebrating its material texture. That is, I guess, the official art world discourse around this film. She's imitating many of her colleagues from the American avant-garde of the 1960s. I don't know whether you've ever seen any of these films like those by Stan Brakhage. Has anyone ever seen any of them? They try to replicate human consciousness and perception. In our imaginations, we don't see things clearly. We see things in fragments, in glimpses, in furtive movements, don't we? Evasive movements. And I think these filmmakers are trying to replicate that on the screen. Consciousness, memory, feeling, and all its evasive character. The other thing that's going on in the mid-1960s is that Carol Lee's friends are getting arrested in New York for showing films that depict nudity and sexuality. They're going to jail. So she has never said this, but I think there's a feeling that abstraction will save the stigma and illegality of sexual imagery, or will diminish the illegality of sexual imagery. The imagery is extremely explicit. I don't know of any other feminist artist from this period who shows fellatio, who shows erect penises and her own vagina. Some of the visual artists are moving in that direction of frank depiction of their bodies, or in performance art, frank depiction of their bodies. But she is really on the cutting edge. She's really ahead of everyone in this frankness. But she sort of attenuates this explicitness with these layers of aesthetics. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think that is going on. Is there also a kind of shame that may be deeply buried under this aesthetics? An avoidance of showing everything really explicitly, a kind of delicacy or tact, perhaps. She would not admit to that, but perhaps that is going on. There was stigma attached to female artists being so frank about their bodies and sexual activity. The women's movement was emerging already by 1967. They were arguing, the feminist leaders, that what is this sexual revolution? We don't feel a part of it. We are being objectified in the pages of Playboy magazine. What is going on? And so feminists were very hesitant about female artists who were being so explicit about sexual relations, especially heterosexual relations. I think feminist artists would have second thoughts about the images of fellatio in the film, for example, simply because it seems like such a submission to the patriarchy. For Carol Lee Schneemann, it was a caress. It was an act of love to her husband, boyfriend. But I think there was an emerging political critique of sexual imagery coming from the women's movement. So I think this is this is all in the atmosphere. The other thing is that she loves provocation. She loves being scandalous. The role of the artist was to create scandal. In one of her performance pieces, she was famous for having stood on a stage, this is a couple of years later, in New York City, and no, am I getting her mixed up? Maybe it was one of her colleagues, Linda Benglis, who removed a scroll from her vagina on stage, unrolled the scroll, and then read a manifesto that was on the scroll. So feminist performance artists really loved creating scandal. And so I think we need to see these films in this context also. At the same time, don't forget, this is a very sentimental film, a tender film about conjugality, isn't it? About this couple. There are beautiful curtains on their bedroom wall, on their bedroom window. It's a bed. They go for lovely walks on the beach. This is a romantic paradise, isn't it? So the sentimentality really clashes with this provocation in a way. So I think it's a very rich and contradictory film, and this is why I showed it to you. I had a feeling that we would need to talk about it afterwards, and this is what we're doing. Any further questions about the film? Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
Just as there were images of fellatio in the film, there were also images of cunnilingus. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Schneemann really came under a lot of fire for these images, for these particular images. Also, the fact that...
And not only cunnilingus, but orgasm. We are seeing her facial reaction to coming, aren't we? And that is almost a kind of forbidden.
I interpreted it as not as coming, but more like the in situ of intercourse. Right? When, of course, it was heterosexual, and the entire film was a heterosexual narrative, but it was not heteronormative. It wasn't heteronormative. It was heterosexual, certainly, but it wasn't heteronormative.
How can you elaborate on that? What do you mean?
A heteronormative. When I say heteronormative, I would mean that it does not pertain or restrict itself or conform to the normativity of heterosexuality. It doesn't.
With the male initiative and the male priority in the sexual acts, the fact that the female
the very fact that this entire film is showing the entire sex act in graphic detail is very non-heteronormative.
And also the fact that there is a female orgasm.
Yes.
Well, I'll come to that. I do not think my personal opinion is that it wasn't orgasm. It wasn't really orgasm, because at that point of time, and even now, myths regarding the entire debate regarding the female orgasm is very strident.
No, it isn't. It has just erupted. Female Sexual Response was published. It's a very influential book, I believe in '65. Can someone Google this, Female Sexual Response, please? Masters and Johnson. We'll get the exact date, and then we'll prove Arjun wrong once again.
Once again, I'll be only left.
Female Sexual Response, what's the date?
I'm just looking.
Okay. Masters and Johnson. What's taking so long?
Yeah, they go eating like all kinds of things.
Put it in quotation marks, female sexual response.
Showing tablets and medicines and
Yeah, like that's what I'm getting.
Even if it's in quotation marks, it shouldn't. And type in Masters, Johnson. These two, it was a man and a woman scientist, and they watched hundreds and hundreds of couples having sex in their laboratory and really studied female orgasm and made it almost a kind of household word for the first time in the 1960s, studying the physiological as well as the psychological components of female orgasm. Did anyone find it yet?
Sorry, 19 to 1965, guys.
Okay, so it has just erupted. She knows about this. She's probably
1966 to be more.
1966. So while she's actually filming this, this is circulating, and I think it was also on the cover of Time magazine, and it's a big thing. Okay, continue.
So my point is not about the female orgasm or even the in situ of the sexual act, but I was especially moved by the projection, or rather the portraiture of the ruptured nature of desire in the film, because desire is something that is not constant, very fluctuating. It is an entirely a spectrum, end of the scale to another end of the scale within a matter of a couple of minutes, if we can think, physiologically or physically about desire. But then what she has done, especially, which is what interested me a lot, she has actually, with her manual manipulating of the celluloid, she has very successfully projected, or rather portrayed, this ruptured nature of desire. There are coming togethers, there are going aways, separations. There are scenes where where the male partner is being portrayed singly. There are scenes where Schneemann herself is being portrayed singly, and then there are couplings, there are POVs, and especially at the end of the film. At the end of the film, where she's wearing a white bikini and running away from the sea towards the beach. So this entire projection of the narrative of desire, especially, something that really moved me. And if I contrast it with, since we're talking about sexual representation, I think the representation of sexual desire is also very important in this case. That's what my point was about.
Okay, excellent points. Thank you. Just expanding on your points and Neha's point as well. Female orgasm is depicted. Male orgasm is not depicted, is it?
It isn't.
And as the porn industry is emerging at this time and in the following years, male orgasm became a very inescapable trope of the hetero porn industry. You all know what I mean by the phrase "cum shot," right?
Mm-hmm.
This became an unavoidable trope of pornography across the board. And it's interesting that her work precedes this or diverges from this. She doesn't seem to be interested in her boyfriend coming. She's much more interested, obviously, in herself. And that's just, that's an interesting point. Anyone else?
I just want to Arjun's point about the going away, the bikini and walking towards the beach. I just couldn't, I actually don't get why are you saying that that's a going away kind of thing.
What? I didn't say that that's a going away. I said there are moments of separation, moments of coupling. I said that. I didn't say that was a going away.
No, because I thought that was a very sensual scene of I think that embodied desire also, even that that separation part. So
of course, it embodies desire, because as I already said, desire is a narrative. If we think of the narrative of desire, it is ruptured. Like most narratives, if we consider the old narrative of sexuality, then desire is a ruptured narrative. It cannot be constant.
At the same time, it's a very interesting coda to the film, connecting her body to this elemental imagery of water, of the sea.
yeah.
And that's very often a female archetype, isn't it?
Yes, obviously.
And speaking of elemental symbolism and allegorical, let's move back to the bed, okay? Because one of you, was it you, B2, said this is allegorical?
It reminded me of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the flying island of Laputa.
It was a flying bed, absolutely. So instead of Broughton being influenced by East Coast abstraction and the art world, high concept performance art, well, it's sort of influenced by performance art. He's much more interested in the heritage of surrealism. Are you two fighting back there?
No, he's eating his nails. That's dirty.
Okay, never mind. Sorry I asked. The heritage of surrealism, of symbolism, of allegory, and it's full of all these very potent iconographies of not only sexuality, but of the whole spectrum of human existence. This bed is the site of birth, death, spirituality, but also carnality.
The two-backed beast.
Sorry, the two-backed beast. And it's we're talking a little bit about this film in the context of the sexual revolution, whether we're talking about the Playboy revolution or whatever. And the interesting thing to me about the film, it is so non-sexist. This is not a Playboy magazine film. This is a non-sexist film where the two genders are shown in equitable interaction. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the full range of human sexuality, not the full range, but a broad range of human sexuality is represented across the spectrum. I think that if we use Plummer's term, telling stories of diversity and multiplicity, this is the film. Schneeman's film is about heterosexuality. This film, The Bed, is about the wide range of human sexual response. It's also much more balletic, dance-like, choreographed. It's acrobatic, isn't it? It's joyous. It's a celebration. I mean, obviously, Fuse is a celebration as well, but this one is like a dance piece.
Very artistic.
Very artistic,
Also, it reminded me of John Donne's poem, The Sun Rising.
which I don't know.
Oh, you don't know?
Was there like I don't like recall very well, but then in Neiman's film, was there an overwhelming use of the color red? There was like I because that is the color that I remember very distinctly, the color red. So could you please elaborate that on a little bit?
I'm sure it was on purpose, and I'm sure she associated redness with her body, her own body,
Maybe passion.
and
There were
passion.
different shades of red. There wasn't one, just
Yeah.
one red. There were different shades of red, which obviously does fit in with what I said of desire being ruptured and lengthened spectrum.
It's interesting if we connect that question to the subsequent film and the whole discussion in self-health about how the color of the cervix changes according to the woman's cycle, and how blood, menstruation, is essential to this notion, to this presence of the female body. So you're absolutely right.
Can I make another point?
Yes.
This is, of course, a bit divergent, but it's very much related to pop culture in America at that point of time. Also, the introduction of Kundalini Tantra at that point of time in America, tantric sex and everything. You know, the sacredness of female sexuality, all of that. I think as an avant-garde artist, Schneeman must have been exposed to at least some of these elements of pop culture.
Absolutely. We saw yoga,
In the bed.
spirituality in the bed.
Uh-huh.
And you're right. Americans had discovered Kama Sutra and Tantric.
The Kama Sutra was much earlier, but I'm talking about especially the idea of tantric sex being sacred, of sex as a sacred and ritualistic act especially in the last shot of the bed where he is saluting the director. I forget his name. That's bespectacled man. He's saluting the snake. So the snake is as a symbol of um, the Kundalini Shakti, which lies coiled at the base of the spine, and is symbolic of the libido, the human libido. Also, there was something very hedonistic about the entire film, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and why I said that it reminded me of John Donne's poem, because the last two lines of of the sun rising is like, "Shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. This bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere." So it's the entire poem is about the exploration of the sex act between two lovers. So that's what I mean. It's an intertext. Every text is an intertext. I'm reading the film as a text. So
And as a poet, I hadn't heard you say John Donne earlier. I heard you say some unrecognizable name. I apologize. But yes, absolutely. And as a poet himself, Broughton knows John Donne, so it's possible that he did reference his ancestors. The other important point I want to make is that in 1967, we need to recognize that this film is softcore. Unlike Fuses, which is hardcore and covered with layers of aesthetics, beautiful clarity of this imagery shows unaroused human bodies who are simulating sexual intercourse and not performing sexual intercourse. Therefore, I think 1967 was a key year in the push towards free sexual speech in the US. It was the year in which softcore erotica was first allowed to show genitalia in magazines and movies. So it's not obscene, but he could have got into trouble if he was showing hardcore, explicit sexual. So
did Schneemann get into any sort of trouble
Yes.
with the law?
Yes.
Okay.
The film was not specifically with the law, but the film could not be distributed fully. It was distributed very cautiously. Okay, have we covered everything on the bed?
Yes, I think.
Okay, any comments on self-health?
Most times it's like very informative. It's information driven.
There was this one point.
Sorry to interrupt, Arjun. Did you finish your point, Neha?
Yeah, it was about.
So, yes, it's didactic, it's informational. I learn so much every time I see this. It's fascinating to me. Okay, Arjun.
I'm sorry. So there's this one interesting point about self-health, and that is the merging of the narrator, the person who narrates the entire anatomy of the female genitalia, and the object of attention, the object of focus. They're one and the same. It's one person who's actually talking about her own genitalia while actually showing it, demonstrating it, or rather, opening it up for viewing for the people, the other people in the film. It could well have been somebody else doing the narrating instead of that person herself doing the.
Let me interrupt you for a second and make a point about documentary. In other films we've looked at, some of you have critiqued the voice of God narrator in documentary, and all of the implications of authoritarian expertise that the voiceover narrator suggests. The whole concept of the expert, the scientific expert, has been now challenged by feminism and by countercultural communities. The expert no longer has authority by the 1970s. And it's community-based expertise that is valued. Therefore, the fact that, as you say, the woman is exploring her own body, she now becomes, as they say, the dialogue continuously says, we are in control of our own bodies.
Yeah.
She is the expert on her own body. Continue.
No, that's what my point was. I seized upon it, and I was thinking about it, that it was indeed a very important decision to do it this way, because that's where the entire message, as you said, the seizing control of their own bodies, doing away with the expert, the medicality of the medicality that is generally associated with this sort of genitalia education. The film does away with that, and that's where I think its success begins. Its the curve of success begins there. I think it was wonderful. Yeah.
Okay.
I learned a lot there.
Also, what is very important is it recognizes the fact that every female body is different. Like, so, and therefore this personalized narrative of demonstrating your own genitalia to other people, that it becomes very important in this context. That I am talking about my own body, and and recognizing the fact that my body is very different from someone else's body. And because this is the tone of scientific expertise, like that they come to a kind of generalization, which a very claimed objectivity and a generalization that this is what a cycle should look like. A 28-day cycle should be like this, and this is when you ovulate, and this is when you this is when the uterus kind of expels everything. So, and that is when you menstruate. So this whole kind of scientific generalization of a woman's cycle is, they go away from that, and that I think is very, very important. This is one of the most important things that the film talks about, the individuality of a female's body.
That said, I fully agree with you. It's very interesting. There is one gap in the film, or one area of avoidance. We were just talking about sexual response. Did you notice they don't really talk about sexual response?
Yeah.
They do not. They do not.
I mean, we see the woman's clitoris, but we don't really learn much about it at all. And these women, these 20 women are sitting around, and they're not talking about having sex ever. So there's a kind of even though this film is amazingly frank and explicit, there's at the same time this kind of chastity about it, or asexuality about it, which seems so contradictory and paradoxical. But what does that have a deeper signification in 1974? That the women's movement is perhaps
what we could interpret it as, I mean, maybe like this, I'm like really going ahead of myself, but then women's body as a sexual object has been explored. I mean, it has been done to death, like talking about sexuality and the sexuality of the female body, but just looking at it as a body, just various organs of your body. That I think that is what that is why I would not call it chastity. I wouldn't say that they were like deliberately coy of calling talking about sexuality, but I think they did it deliberately, and they refused to acknowledge the sexuality of the body, and instead just focused on just the organs and what the basically what the organs are for and how you take care of it, etc., etc. I think I wouldn't say that they were deliberately.
I think there was a subtle writing back. There was a subtle writing back to the patriarchy, patriarchal agency there. Excluding the presence of the male genitalia, which is important if you talk about sexual intercourse, or even the other sexual partner, excluding their presence entirely, and talking only about the body in question. So I think that's a sort of a writing that.
Well, you can't do everything in one film, and perhaps they said, we just have 20 minutes, this is what we'll do. Also remember the date of the film, it's 1974. This is the era of porno chic. San Francisco, where the film was made, is full, suddenly, of porn theaters showing explicit hardcore films. So these women, in a way, are dissenting, as you imply, from this other image of women's sexuality that is on screens all around the city and the nation. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
But talking about pleasure and differentiating pleasure from procreation is not a kind of accepting the patriarchal ideology as well. If they talk about more about what you have told, they are not talking about their sexuality. They were just talking about the scientific aspects, how to take care of their bodies and all.
Right. They talk more about birth control than they do about procreation, don't they? At one moment they say the sperm goes through the opening in the cervix, and then that's it. But
I agree with you.
it's an interesting.
They say it's the only way the sperm can enter.
Yeah,
the
exactly. Yeah.
The only way.
Okay. Now we have 3 more films I want us to talk about. What about the 2 gay lib testimony films? They really fit into the pattern of Ken Plummer's telling sexual stories, don't they? We only looked at about 1/4, 1/5 of Word Is Out, the stories of awakening to sexual difference and desire in Word Is Out. In Trucks, we had a narrative, according to what Plummer would call it, of suffering and oppression, and then transcendence and community formation, all through this police oppression, triggered by the police oppression. So the 2 films are very different. They have in common this use of telling stories of sexual identity. What was your feelings about those 2 works? Any observations? Can you believe the police in 1977 in my hometown entered this place with machine guns? Can you believe it? Yes, you can, obviously, but it's important to remember this is the era of the sexual revolution. My town, Montreal, had just hosted the Olympics in 1976. The municipal administration was celebrating the city all around the world, so they decided it was time to clean up the city, closing down these dens of sin, both the gay community and sex work, and they triggered this crisis in society by doing so. So it's a very interesting historical moment. Any observation about these 2 films?
Again, in Word Is Out, the voice of God narrative has been done away with. It's people telling their own stories. So we can connect it to the other points that we have discussed thus far. That it is again people talking about themselves and their experiences. And the other thing that's the whole genre of committed documentary. It was documenting a certain people's movement. So that's.
I think the Trucks film was so zero budget, they felt they couldn't make it make sense without having a voiceover, and it is a defect of the film, isn't it? Just a little bit rough. Anyone else? Okay, what about this 100-year-old porn film. Any observations about that? Anything that surprised you about this film? Perhaps its very existence was surprising.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, it was part of a whole underground commercial landscape. So it was one of hundreds of films that were being produced and circulating clandestinely both in Europe and America. And these films have almost got lost and forgotten. When I discovered them several years ago, I thought these films need to be brought to the surface and re-examined for what they tell us about the past, about history, about the history of sexuality. And this is in many ways one of my favorites, maybe because it's based on opera, I don't know, but it's an amazing film. Anything else that surprised you about the film?
The use of kimonos.
So the art design was quite ambitious for a porno film, wasn't it?
Usually this Victorian dress and rural dress are usually. What I'm saying is that the use of this dress kimono is like an Asian dress, which is not that much modern. As a stimulus to erotic desires, and usually I heard that the use of a Victorian dress as a symbol of sexuality, sexual desires.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I mean, the original story was a 19th century story set in Japan.
But there was the existence of Giza, means, I mean, who were...
Use the mic, it's right in front of you. Here we go.
There were some women who were generally known as Giza, who used to be attired in traditional dresses, and they used to actually attract the so-called customers and all, which is
No, but the geisha is not a prostitute. She's a
not a prostitute. Yeah, okay.
She's a courtesan.
Yeah,
So there are no customers there.
Yeah, but they are not then involved in sex.
No,
Well, in the West, according to Western stereotype, they don't make that those distinctions. And clearly, for the audience and the makers of this film, using European actors with Asian makeup on, this kind of misinformed stereotyping is there. It's clearly a kind of quiche stereotype that is being constructed. And the art design, the Asian dress, is very much a part of the erotic address of the film, isn't it?
And this floral designs also.
It's surprisingly ambitious. I mean, you would think a cheap porno film would not be able to afford this kind of ambitious art design. It actually does. So there was a whole infrastructure there that was able to produce films like this in Paris in the 1920s. It's very interesting.
And also it does talk about, what surprised me is it talks about women, it showed a woman being pleasured and not just the man being pleasured. So that I thought was...
the woman being pleasured both by a woman and by a man.
Yeah.
So again, like the bed, it shows the spectrum of sexual diversity, doesn't it?
Yeah. But though this does not, but it still at least shows the woman being pleasured. But I think I think I wouldn't associate 1920s with this kind of sexual liberation where they talk about.
It's more like fire, isn't it? It's situational lesbianism.
Yeah.
And for the men, sort of situational homosexuality rather than, in the absence of their heterosexual partners, rather than a 1960s spectrum of sexual diversity, absolutely. Any other
I think
observation?
the term butterfly is an indicator of this being a story of deception.
Well, the original opera was based on, I think, a French play. And I don't know where the play got the term butterfly from. It's an English word, and it was a French play made into an Italian opera, and they maintained the English word butterfly, even though it's set in Japan. So I don't know what the connotation might be, but you might be onto something. Anyone else? I just want to point out, we've been talking about cum shots. Did you notice that there was a cum shot in the film?
Yeah, the masturbation.
Yeah. The cum shot is not yet formalized or codified as a part of the porn film recipe. It's very sporadic in these stag movies. They're called stag movies of the 1920s and 30s. It's only when we get to porn industry, the 1970s, that things get strictly codified so that every scene ends with a cum shot. So it's just sort of an interesting forewarning of a trope that would be codified 50 years later. And it's interesting that the sex, both same-sex sexual relationships are based on hierarchy, aren't they? Between the master or mistress and their servants. So what does that mean? It's sort of obvious, but it's also interesting, isn't it? But it doesn't seem to be coercive. The servants are really into it. So what does that say?
Yeah, I was reminded of a kind of erotic cinema, Fanny Hill, and which came later. A bit.
Well, yes and no. Fanny Hill is an 18th century novel, but it was republished in the 20th century as part of what Escoffier terms this push towards free sexual speech. I remember when I was a teenager, when suddenly Fanny Hill became legal, and I went out and immediately bought a copy. And my mother caught me with it. That's not really relevant to this, but Fanny Hill also depicts a world of feudal relationships, doesn't it? Where the sex worker heroine is involved in relationships of power with her clients, her aristocratic clients. So
And
that's
literary figures.
it prefigures, doesn't it?
Literary figures. Alexander Pope figures in the novel as well.
He does. Okay. Any other observations? Okay, let's just wrap up then. So I think these films really illustrate well Plummer's major point that we have become a sexual storytelling confessional society. These 6 films didn't particularly focus on mainstream pop cultural cinema, did they? But most of the films borrow from pop cultural motifs, don't they? Whether we're talking about avant-garde autobiographers or documentary filmmakers or community-based filmmakers, they're always borrowing or citing pop cultural imagery. The important thing about many of them is their use of autobiographical discourse, first-person discourse, confession, and testimony, literally telling sexual stories. The presence of the avant-garde with both Broughton and Schneemann is important. We often see the role of the avant-garde as prophesying or foretelling preoccupations that will surface in the mainstream culture and the next generation, don't we? So certainly we can see Broughton and Schneemann as anticipating issues that are about to emerge in a very clear way. To think of Butterfly as an underground work, an illicit work that flourishes in the black market is very interesting, because the history of sexual representation has to include the black market, the underground. And it's only with the sexual revolution that this underground comes to the surface. In the 1970s era in the West of porno chic, of theatrical porn, through the video revolution of the 1980s and 90s, through the internet revolution of the current century, where we have porn everywhere on the internet, even in India, with a kind of semi-licit status. And I would like to term the internet phenomenon as a kind of third sexual revolution. And this is what my current book is about. Conception of the last quarter century. I will come to this in a minute when we think about the sexual revolution as a third sexual revolution that has as wide sweeping as the second revolution of the 1960s. And finally, the other important thing to recognize is that in all 6 of these films, we see subaltern bodies and hear subaltern voices. We do not hear the dominant patriarchal, heteropatriarchal male voices. We hear and see women, we see sexual minorities, we hear sex workers, and they perform both as spectacle and in terms of empowered subjects with agency. There's a kind of contradiction going there, especially with the Butterfly film. You can imagine the heterosexual audience of 1925 jeering and hooting at the alternative sexual acts in that film, right? They must have gone crazy seeing the manservant filleting his master, right? But probably within that audience, there were dissimulating sexual minorities. Is it possible? It's likely, isn't it? So difference existed within this world, even though it would have been silenced. So maybe there was a kind of empowerment going on at the same time as there was a spectacularization of the other, of the subaltern. I think that's true of all of the works we're looking at today, and in general throughout the sexual revolution, there is this kind of double operation going on of spectacularization and empowerment. And do I have another slide? Oh, I don't. So let's wrap up there. Any final question, comment? Okay, it's time for tea, isn't it? How is my Are they out in the corridor?
No, we can't see them.
So they have decamped.
Exactly.
In Indian English, when a criminal has run away, I forget what there's this Victorian expression you use.
Absconded.
What is it?
Absconding.
Absconded, yes. They've absconded. Okay, the sexual revolution, and for this I got you to read Escoffier's introductory essay on the sexual revolution. It's quite readable, I hope. Found it okay? He's an anthropologist by training, but also an editor and an intellectual historian, also an activist and a safer sex community activist. Very interesting guy. So I hope you liked his essay. He traces several factors that contributed to the sexual revolution of the post-war era, beginning in the even in the late 1940s and continuing up until the 1970s. I tried to assemble some images that expressed his, his four currents that he talks about. One, he talks about the influence of Freudian theories of the orgasm. Orgasm is specifically Wilhelm Reich in his notorious orgone box, for which he was persecuted in the US. I mean, aside from the anecdotal aspects of that history, I think he's right that there became a cult of the orgasm within popular culture that was very much a part of the sexual revolution. We talked in the previous lecture about female sexual response from 1966, 67, which I think also contributed to this heightened awareness and knowledge of human sexual response. The news that women, in particular, not only experienced sexual climax, but had the right to sexual climax was a fundamental, I think, plank in the platform of the new sexual revolution. So I don't know how much of this was due to Reich and Freudian theories, but it's certainly true that it was part of the overall dynamic. He also talks about Dr. Kinsey, that's him on the left. I love this cover of Time magazine from 1953 that literally shows the birds and the bees, so this is why I included it. This was the year in which he published Human Sexual Response in the Female, I believe is the exact title. Now I've lost it. I think that's it. 5 years after the initial shocking book from 1948 on male human sexuality. 1948, by the way, was the year of my birth, so I was born in a very important year. That wasn't Indian independence, was it? Independence is 47. So I was conceived in the year of Indian independence, all right? And born the following year. So the role of biological data and knowledge in the sexual revolution is very clear. Kinsey, like Plummer, was someone who got sexual stories from thousands of subjects, and the data he produced shocked America, as you read in Escoffier, especially the fact that, for example, 1/3 of all American men had had a sexual experience with a man to climax at one point in their lives. To hear this in 1948 staggered the culture. He eventually was so scandalizing that he had his funding removed, and basically this anticipated his early death in the year 1957, I believe, or 56. So, knowledge about demographic sexual behaviors became instrumental in this paradigmatic shift, both in sexual attitudes and sexual behaviors. He also mentions the push towards freedom of sexual speech, the broadening of the boundaries of acceptable sexual speech through jurisprudence. This is why I've included the image of the American Supreme Court. The challenge, repeated challenge throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s to obscenity statutes. And you were correct to mention Fanny Hill as being one of the many literary and artistic works that figure in this sequence of events. And then the fourth current that he mentions is the link to radical social movements. Not only the American Civil Rights Movement, which, even though it was not focusing on sexuality, created a culture of empowerment and access to rights that diffused over into the domain of sexuality. The image I have here, though, is from the women's movement that emerged in the late 60s, and I think was also a huge, important contributory factor in the sexual revolution, even though one wing of the women's movement were maybe the most dominant wing of the women's movement were very skeptical about Playboy, about the sexual revolution, and could be characterized by the word I used before that some of you disagreed with, chastity, okay? You recognize what's going on in this image, or is it too small? Can you tell what's going on there? What are they putting in the freedom trash can? They're burning their bras and throwing them in the trash can, okay? So this is the same kind of spirit of affirmation of the body that we saw in the film yesterday, and this affirmation of the body also fed into the slightly later gay and lesbian liberation movements that really only got their energy in the 1970s as well. He also registers a cautionary note. So far, the feeling of the momentum of sexual revolution has a kind of utopian feel to it, but he has a cautionary note. He is very clear about critics of the sexual revolution who talked about co-optation, about commodification, and Marcuse in particular, who theorized repressive desublimation, the fact that the consumer society harnesses these sexual energies to diffuse dissent and difference, which is quite clearly an accompanying phenomenon. So he does a good job of summing up all of these currents and contributing factors. I think he might have emphasized even more, however, the role of commodification in the marketplace. I think that sexuality became a product in the 50s and 60s and 70s, is at the very center of this history. And we're not only talking about magazines, erotic magazines, we're talking about several related industries, everything from the counseling industry to the marriage industry to the self-help industry, the publishing industry. There's a huge industrial complex that plugged into this, the energy of the sexual revolution and enabled it. I think it's at the very center and should not be minimalized. Any questions so far? What about the women's sexual revolution? I said that there was a very influential wing of the women's movement that was skeptical about the claims of the sexual revolution. This led into a very strong tendency that critiqued pornography, that discovered sexual abuse and rape as urgent and first priority political causes towards the end of the 70s. And it's even thought, it even felt at the time that the women's movement was entirely focused on those three issues in the late 70s. And the anti-porn movement was extremely strident and strong, but every action provokes an equal and opposite reaction. And what interests me is the reaction in the early 80s of what I would call the bad girls reaction, the bad girls pro-sex movement of the 1980s, which enabled a kind of adjunct to the men's sexual revolution of the 60s, which we could call maybe the women's sexual revolution of the 1980s. And there are some documents. In 1982, there was a famous conference at Barnard College in New York, the Barnard Women's Conference on Sexuality, and this.
We can't hear you actually.
I need to do my shirt up. Is that better now? No? Is that better now? No? I should be wearing a proper collar, not one of these narrow collars, should I? Okay, thank you. This is a scene from the Barnard Conference where women are gathering around having a workshop or a rap group on masturbation. Masturbation being another topic that our 1974 film Yesterday didn't even touch, did it? And I use the word touch advisedly. This figure with the bare back is named Betty Dodson. She was famous during the self-help movement of the 1970s for writing books and coloring books and picture books on women's masturbation. So there she is leading a workshop at the Barnard Conference. The woman in this polka dot shirt is Joan Nestle, who at that point was founding the Lesbian Repertory Archives in New York City. I'm not sure who the other women are, but clearly there's a buzz in that group, isn't there? And this led to a very active pro-sex movement, which led to a special issue of the feminist magazine Heresies, the sex issue. It led to a very interesting anthology, a scholarly anthology in the mid-1980s, whose title sums up a kind of productive tension around women's attitude towards sexuality, pleasure, and danger. And that image with the woman's high heel shoes and the steps is very well chosen cover, isn't it? And what's at the top of the stairs? Is that Pandora's box that's about to open? I think it might be. 20 years later, the current was still very forceful, and a book came out called Feminist Porn Book, also an anthology. And the important difference with this book is that not only are feminist academics editing and contributing to the book, but sex workers, porn stars, and porn makers, female sex workers and porn stars, are also contributing to the book. So academics in those 20 years, feminist academics, have become much more inclusive. So I think this is important to recognize that the second sexual revolution had basically two thrusts. The initial Playboy magazine men's entitlement phase, and then a second thrust in the 1980s, in which women appropriated the sexual revolution for their own use. Any questions about this? Yes. No?
I think this pro-sex is also today, in today's world, there is sex positive movement, sex positive feminism. That is actually the origin of.
But go ahead, continue.
That is now what they are talking about the sex. There is the difference between the feminists. Like today, also there is debate between anti-porn movement and sex positive feminism. So I think the origin is from there.
I think so too. At the same time, here in India, there's widespread public discourse around danger,
Yeah.
about rape culture,
Yeah. And the pornography.
about sexual harassment, about pornography, that is in a very delicate relationship with the sex positive energy. It's also true in the West, and it's in
I
a,
think Catherine McKinnon or someone who was anti-porn kind of.
did she come here? No,
I'm
yeah,
talking about
Yeah.
Western context.
yeah, Catherine McKinnon is like a key figure of the anti-porn movement. And I mean, I don't want to get into that especially, but they had a serious impact on the Canadian Criminal Code, which we are still living with today, enshrining the concept of harm in the obscenity statute, which impacts primarily on sexual minorities. So the anti-porn movement has some historical things to answer for, in my opinion. But the productive tension between the two wings of the women's movement, I think, is a very interesting and enduring phenomenon. Any other comment or question? Okay. I think what I would like to do is, coming back to Kinsey, is show you a little clip from a Hollywood biopic about Kinsey that was made maybe a decade ago that I think underlines Plummer's whole thesis about telling sexual stories. So it's the concluding scene to the film, and we'll look at it on YouTube, and it depicts Dr. Kinsey sort of at the end of his very controversial career, listening to one of the female subjects whose story he heard. Okay, so I'll just take 1 second to find it. I don't want you to read my email. You can if you want. YouTube. So it's interesting that 50 years after Kinsey's death, Hollywood produces a biopic on Kinsey and calls the film Kinsey. And this character has become so mythologized that the single name provides this recognition of an American hero, doesn't it? One who has changed society completely. And you recognize the various generic conventions of the biopic, right? This is the ending of the film. Dr. Kinsey is told how much he has changed the world by this fan. And it's a very beautiful scene, and there's very heartstring music playing as this great actress, Lynn Redgrave, is delivering her lines. And it's sort of like, it's interesting that the last scene of the film comes from one of his subjects, not from his wife. We just had a glimpse of his wife in the secret. The climax of the film comes from one of his subjects who confesses to him. And so Hollywood recognizes the mythology not only of Kinsey, this hero, but also of confession and confessionality, first-person testimony as a building block of American culture 50 years later that he inaugurated. And this takes us back to Plummer, doesn't it? She is telling him a sexual story, and telling this story has changed her life, has had a therapeutic function for almost a salvation for her. And this is what Plummer calls the modern conception of telling sexual stories, this kind of coherent and unified social function of telling stories. This is not a postmodern or a late modern conception of storytelling. There are no doubts allowed in this beautiful melodramatic ending that is so effective. None of the fracturing that we saw in Fuses is there. It ties up the film so beautifully. So Hollywood, of course. Sorry, who is someone speaking? No. Hollywood is usually about 50 years behind the avant-garde, which is normal. But it's interesting that this whole project is mythologized by the film at this point. Okay, any comments or questions at this time? And remember, Hollywood's film is coming out, I think the date is 2005 or something like this, at a point when a new sexual revolution has already happened. And I'm wondering if it's going to take 50 years for Hollywood to start mythologizing the third sexual revolution, or what I think we can conveniently call the third sexual revolution. That is that created by the technology of the internet and globalization starting in the mid-90s. 1995, I guess, is the official year when internet became commercialized, widespread commercially in consumer settings. Before that, it had been largely industrial or professional. Now it became a consumer product around 1995. And this has revolutionized global society and culture, as you know. In the 2000s, the introduction of Web 2, social media, webcams, tube sites, and the list goes on and on and on, has created a complete complex of first-person sexual discourse, hasn't it? We are all familiar with, and which touches all of us every single day, doesn't it? Unless we're a hermit in a cave, which some of us are, I guess. But I think that this sexual revolution is equally profound to the one of the 1960s, in that not only attitudes are profoundly shifted, but behaviors too. For example, I'm sure you all have many examples that you're going to about this. Unlike the second sexual revolution, you could even argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, but here in Indian culture, it could be argued that Indian culture sort of bypassed the second sexual revolution, and in many ways, and fully embraced the third sexual revolution. Am I being like loose and exaggerating in this, or is this one of the things that's going on? And one aspect of this shift is this shift in confessionality as a widespread industry are the many stories of diversity and multiplicity that are everywhere in the atmosphere around us. So this is the topic of this book that I've just been working on. It's an anthology with 30 chapters that deals not only with the internet, but also the art world and analog culture, which now has to be situated in relation to digital culture because they're in the same landscape. And it deals not only with the art world, but also the porn world, because again, the boundaries between the two have almost evaporated within this third sexual revolution. And it deals with the entire spectrum, like the bed, of sexual behavior and identities. It no longer cloisters off sexual identity and category, but deals with a continuous spectrum. So I hope that this book is reaching an understanding of this phenomenon that we'll be able to profit from and help us understand what's going on around us. Any comments or questions? How do you feel about my risk-taking, excessive generalization about Indian culture and the second sexual revolution and the third sexual revolution? Am I right?
How do you?
Can you use the mic issue, please?
Is there any relation with Indian cabaret to revolution?
Yes. My theory about that is that Indian culture is very segmented, and the cosmopolitan centers like Mumbai are in many ways distant from regional and rural cultures. And in the cosmopolitan centers, the sex industry is fully functioning, and Western identities and sexual discourses are everyday discourse. And this polarization between the urban and the rural has always been characterized in many societies, maybe especially in the global south, but not only. And I think India cabaret shows this, the fact that Rosie returns to her rural village and there is so much disparity between the urban world and the rural world that no one will speak to anyone. So you could argue that the sex industry, the way it was functioning in Mumbai in the 1980s, had imported certain aspects of the Western sexual revolution to the cosmopolitan areas of India. However, of course, the sex industry has always functioned in Indian cities and the countryside, right? But in particular cultural formats, whether we're talking about the nautch girls or whoever, courtesans or court dancers or whatever. I mean, I'm not an expert on this topic. I would love to hear experts elaborate on this, but I think India Cabaret explains that. And it's interesting that the old left in India, which Anand could be said to represent, really doesn't come to think about the politics of sexuality until later. Bombay, our city, is not about sexuality, and that's okay. But the fact that it is not, doesn't touch sexuality till 90s or the 2000s is I think, significant. The old left had real trouble formulating the politics of sexuality. The old left supported the nuclear family and inherited sexual ideologies and did not challenge them. Although, of course, the old left did champion women's rights, but within the framework of inherited familial values. I haven't refined these thoughts. These are just rambling thoughts in answer to your question, and I took them far abroad. And that's what I'm thinking. Anyone else? Sorry.
The emergence of a confessional mode of poetry also is seen in the 1950s and 1960s.
Here.
No, in
the West.
America, yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton. So does it have any correlation with the cellulite?
Absolutely. I think literature always has its finger on the pulse of the culture. And for these poets to emerge at this time is no coincidence at all. And not only in poetry, but also in general literature and fiction. And there was a book published in the mid-70s about, I think it's called The Culture of Narcissism. So already in the 1970s, the first-person industrial complex was being critiqued by social critics in reaction to the emergence of confessionality and first-person culture. But it continued to proliferate, and who could have predicted that the internet would enshrine the first person as the foundational discourse of the entire culture? Anyone else?
I think what we were talking about that day, the moralistic view, when we talk about the divide between urban and rural, which we are talking about India Cabaret and all. So I think the moralistic view is prevalent in both cases. I mean, good girl, bad girl, the way we are discussing about India Cabaret and that was the feminist Gulabi gang or Gulabi, which we are talking about. So, who is a good girl, good woman, and who is not? Respectability and immorality. These kinds of.
So both filmmakers.
I cannot see in India Cabaret as a kind of sexual revolution in Indian context. It is much more rather than there is one film Astitva by Taboo. If a film is there, existence. Yeah, Chandni Bar.
Chandikar?
Chandni Bar.
Chandni Bar.
Chandikar. You'll have to give me that reference, okay? So I think I agree with your argument. I think India Cabaret belongs to a genre that we might call the abject, in which an artist explores the bad, the undercurrent of society, the underside, and does not affirm, even though Rekha is a very resilient and positive character in the film, with the fact that she escapes is very significant. So this film belongs to, I think, the lower depths, to tradition. And even the imagery, this filthy and disgusting club with all these disgusting fat men.
And shameless.
Fat, shameless, unshaven. It works, right? And the fact that this world is counterbalanced to this middle class Gujarati home, which is so brightly lit, and I think adds to the generic character of this film, that it's about the lower depths, the abject, the gutter.
And when she was talking about confessional poetry by Sylvia Plath, I was actually reminded of Kamala Das's poetry in this case. Kamala Das and
Which is also very first person, isn't it?
yeah, confessional poetry, sexuality.
Is she still writing?
No, she died.
She died. Okay, sorry. Anyone else? This was a broad generalization I made. I'm surprised no one is objecting. Raj?
Thank you for that broad generalization. It makes me think a little more, because surprisingly, 1975 also was the time when Indira Gandhi had declared emergency. And we do not see anything, any films or any other things in terms of subversion or questioning the structure. So I think a little more probing I will have to do in this aspect.
Yes. I don't know. I followed the emergency from afar, and I don't know all the details. When she rounded up everyone, put them in jail, did she also target women's movement people? Does anyone know?
So there was a lot of post-sterilization. Maybe we can explore that aspect.
So during the emergency, I know that part, that Sanjay and his gangs were stepping up their pro-sterilization campaigns.
And not this pro-sterilization, there was a lot of forced sterilization.
Forced sterilization, yeah.
I don't know, how to locate that, because see, the whole concept of family planning and being choosing like to give birth, that is a very progressive idea. But then the very fact that the state took hold of that and there's a contradiction here. The state made this very progressive idea very regressive, and it took your agency away. So maybe we can discuss that a little bit in regards to emergency. And,
We're going to touch on this with Deepa Dhanraj's film, Something Like a War, in a couple of days, about the abuses of the family planning industry. So I think that's a very well-connected comment. Anyone else? Okay, we are going to end early today because my voice has almost completely disappeared. And we shall see you at 4 o'clock. We're looking at 2 autobiographical queer films from the 1970s at 4 o'clock. One by the experimental lesbian filmmaker Barbara Hammer, both from the U.S. First, the shorts, 1 or 2 shorts by Barbara Hammer, and then full-length autobiographical film by Tom Jocelyn called Black Star, and it's from the mid-70s. And I think the readings we've done on telling sexual stories will really help us understand those 2 artists when we look at them at 4 o'clock. So I will see you all at 4 o'clock.
So now,